A ceremony was held today in our port to celebrate the arrival of the season's first saltie. Duluth and Superior leaders came together at the Clure Public Marine Terminal to welcome the captain and crew of the Federal Nagara. Duluth Seaway Port Authority Executive Director Deb DeLuca presented gifts to that captain. The first saltie marks the importance of the Twin Ports' role in global trading.
The first ocean-going vessel of the season reinforces the importance of global trade to the Port of Duluth Superior. Indeed, that global trade is very much part of our life's blood.
The winner of the 42nd annual First Ship Contest was also announced at today's ceremony, and that person won an array of gift cards to our Duluth businesses as well as future events. And there's no